Welcome to aminacademy.com. Let us do the history of the Greek world and the philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were Greek philosophers who taught at a school that is now a university. They were the part of lineage of thinkers who passed their knowledge on to teach others. Socrates from 469 to 399 BCE, considered the father of Western philosophy, known for his eccentric behavior and irreverence, believed that the health of the soul was the most important good for a human being, tutored people in the streets in addition to teaching at a school, left little written work, so much of what we know about him comes from his students. Plato, 427 to 347 BCE, Socrates' student who studied ethics, virtue, and justice, known as the father of idealism, inspired the work of Aristotle, tried to persuade Dionysius II to renounce his power in favor of Plato's ideals. Aristotle, Plato's student who studied ethics, physics, biology, and astronomy, often credited with developing the study of logic, laid the foundation for modern day zoology. Now we'll discuss some detail about that Greek philosophers. Let me to read. The Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and many of their followers understood their own intellectual activity, the search for the wisdom or philosophy, both as theoretical and practical in its aim. Their goals were very different from the goals of contemporary philosophy, to say the least. To better understand that, we need to know what they taught about wisdom and its place in a well lived life. By the time that Socrates was born, the pre-philosophical tradition of the ancient Greeks, composed by poets and playwrights, had already explored the themes of well-lived life in some ways, taking inspiration from the Greek myths and other sources available then. The ancient Greek word for happiness, that is eudaimonia, originally signified being favored by the gods' good spirits. The facts suggest that originally human prosperity in ancient Greek culture was thought to rely on the idea that the gods are in control of our happiness. Greek society before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. It was through his perspective that Homer and Hesiod delineated models of conduct, of virtue for their readers and listeners. However, it's important to note that these models conflict with one another. There was a tension between the individualism of the heroic code in Homer's work and the more collectivist and work related values in Hesiod's work. This tension echoed socio-political events that occurred in ancient Greek societies. At the same moments that pre-Socratic philosophy seemingly reached a point of stagnation, Socrates began to put the questions of the good life in the center of his philosophical inquiries. As suggested above, there was already some tensions amongst the pre-philosophical ideals regarding that a good life is supposed to be. These types of tensions also resembled the conflict between mythological and the Greek colonies that incited the first philosophers to inquire about nature. It is possible that this was known by Socrates, who was first attracted to the kind of naturalistic philosophy of his predecessors. With Socrates, a new way of thinking about human happiness emerged in a moment of apparent philosophical stagnation. a way of thinking that will be rationally argued for, not merely represented through art. The idea that human knowledge or wisdom is essential to the well-lived human life. From the moment human action rightly conducted by reasons would be considered as the key to the happiness, at least amongst the philosophers. This line of the thought will be articulated in different way by the main successors of Socrates. First by Plato and then by Plato's best student Aristotle. It was also because of this general idea that the schools of Epicureanism or Stoicism developed their theories. They were variations of the Socratic idea, so much so that the Stoics recognized Socrates as their direct predecessors. But if we want to better understand the story, we need to start from the beginning. We will see in very broad lines what Socrates thought about the good life and places wisdom takes in it. After that, we will see what Plato and Aristotle thought about the concept of the wisdom. Socratic wisdom, the importance of knowledge for good life. Socrates is considered as a paragon of wisdom to this day, even though he did not consider himself wise. When the Pythia at the oracle of Delphi said that no one was wiser than Socrates, it only motivated him to engage even more in philosophical debates. This consciousness of his own ignorance propelled him to test the word of the oracle. In many of his conversations, they reconstructed, especially in the work of Plato and Xenophon, we encountered Socrates repeatedly putting the questions of the good life in the center of his discussion. That is, he asked his interlocutors and himself how to live well. However, many other times he addresses other questions only secondary to this matter. Every reader of the early Platonic dialogues known that Socrates spends a lot of time discussing the virtue of courage, of piety, for example. Already during Socrates' lifetime, human virtue was associated with successes when, even though in the pre-philosophical traditions of ancient Greece, virtue was not considered something completely under the human control, and it was common to think that the favor of the gods could not be dismissed. The lives of Achilles and Odysseus, respectively in the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, are examples of that. This begins to change with Socrates. If we believe in what Plato says in his early dialogues, which are the main references for the analysis of Socrates' thought, the relation between virtue and good life, or at least between virtue and a life of success in some specific activity like war, navigation, or carpentry, was not only suggested to Socrates by element of his culture, but by his own independent reflections. His analysis both simple and original. He begins by pondering everyday objects. This is why we see Socrates repeatedly speaking of tools and domestic utensils in the early Platonic dialogues. Take knives as one example. For Socrates, the virtue of a knife is obviously to cut well. To do this, it needs to have some specific characteristics like being sharp, having an adequate weight, and providing a good grip, and so forth. It is because of this specific set of characteristics that the knife can do what is supposed to do well. That is, it's because of the presence of these characteristics that it can perform with excellence the proper functions, ergon. That is the end or purpose of it. Absent of these characteristics, a knife cannot be any good. We can apply the sometimes relationship. of living beings. A good horse or a good dog are those that have the specific set of characteristics that enables them to fulfill the fullest expressions of their potential at horses and dogs. The specific set of characteristics varies, of course, according to the nature of each thing. The main thing to note here is that this general thought pattern could be applied to humans too. What exactly what Socrates did? To summarize a long story, we can say that Socrates tried to answer the questions of good life starting from these considerations. For him, all human activities are conducted by reason, or as the ancient philosophers usually said, by the soul. More than that, Socrates thought that we are motivated to do the what at any time appears to be good according to our minds. This thesis is known today as a Socratic intellectualism. However, it's evidence that what seems to be good to us and what in fact is good for us are not always the same. For Socrates, that means that means that we can only act well even in our own interest. When we have a knowledge of how to act well, that is, when we possess the knowledge of how things are, what is good, and what to do to obtain the preserve these things, how to best utilize them, how to avoid what is bad, and so forth. That means that it is only when we know what is good without error what we can confidently act to obtain that good. Hence human excellence is an excellence of the mind. That is a state where the mind is in possession of knowledge. That state of mind is also what Socrates calls wisdom, that is sophia. The exact nature of wisdom and its relations with eudaimonia in Socrates. Ethics is a matter of academic disputes to this day. This subject is too vast to discuss in this article. What is important to notice is that taking into consideration what has just been said about wisdom, many questions are left under unanswered. In fact, that is a constant feature of Socratic philosophy. It's not clear. For example, if Socrates thought that any specific domain or domains of knowledge should have priority above others. As I noted above, he spends a lot of time talking about virtue, and virtue is a kind of knowledge for him. Should we learn about the specific virtues before any other knowledge? Are they any good in isolation, or only when we grasp all of the virtues that they becomes truly good? Some other passages suggest that Socrates thought about what we ordinarily think of as goods, like money and health, as good. Apparently, Socrates thought that even these things are the subjects of specific kinds of knowledge, but we can't know if he thought that this knowledge is to be searched for before and after we acquire others. One thing we can know for sure, Socrates was aware of our cognitive limitations, and as humans, we never thought we can be wise, that is completely wise, with our minds being in the possession of all possible knowledge. In his opinion, that is something that only the gods can achieve. Every knowledge we can acquire is only provisional and fallible. And not only that, but we also cannot know everything. All we can do is that to keep searching, keep reviewing our concepts and conclusions. That is all we can do, is to search for wisdom, or in other words, the philosophize. Platonic wisdom, the virtue of philosophers in the ideal city state. Socrates' pupil Plato, of course, was also interested in epistemology and stated the practical importance of knowledge for human beings. The allegory of the cave is not meant to encourage ignorance, after all. Here, however, I will only briefly explore what Plato has to say about wisdom in his most famous dialogue, The Republic. Like Socrates, Plato also was interested in thinking about the relations between arete and eudaimonia as way of answer to questions of the good life. However, not only does he not consider wisdom as the main virtue, but he also conceptualizes it completely differently. Plato traces a distinction between wisdom and knowledge, almost like Socrates, but for Plato, wisdom is something different than the state where the mind has perfect knowledge of everything. It's important to consider his psychological theory first if we want to understand his concept of wisdom and its place in his ethics. Plato thought that the human mind is divided into three parts: the rational part, that is logisticon, the spirited part, thymoids, and the appetitive part. Each is responsible for a function of the human mind, thinking, feeling, and desiring, respectively. Even though every mind is formed by these three parts, in each idea in one of us, so the theory goes, one of these parts is always more prominent. As a consequence, Plato says that there are three types of character which he presents in the myth of three metals. There were those that have souls made of gold, dominated by the rational part, those who have souls of silver, dominated by the spirited part, and those who have soul of bronze, dominated by the appetitive part. The Platonic discussion of wisdom appears in the course of exposition about the Callipolis, the ideal city state. It's here that we find Plato's idea that wisdom is a form of eubulia, that is, a capacity to give good advice or for sound judgment. Far from being the universal virtue available to all, this capacity is a form of intellectual excellences that can be achieved solely by trained philosophers. That is, for those who have a soul made of gold, in his ideal polis, those people should lead the government as kings or queens. It is for that reason, at least in the context of his republic, that Plato considered that wisdom as eubulia can be achieved only by some people who can submit to an extensive educational program, but once they became governors, this virtue could confer benefits to all the citizens of the polis. That's one of the reasons why the Callipolis is the ideal city. As for the individuals with souls of silver or bronze, even though we can assume that Plato would concede that they could develop some degrees of eubulia in some limited affairs, they would never be able to be wise. In any case, we should notice that Plato's ethics differ considerably from Socrates. That contrast becomes even clear in Plato's later work, but that is an entirely different topic. Aristotelian wisdom, two virtues instead of one. In his Nicomachean Ethics, book 6, Aristotle presents a more detailed accounts of wisdom than that of his predecessors. It's interesting to consider some other basic aspects of his ethics before we enter into his discussion of wisdom. For Aristotle, arete and eudaimonia are also correlated. Like Plato, Aristotle did not believe that all human beings have the same capacity for virtue. Unlike Plato, he thought that only those who received a good education from childhood to early adulthood could become a virtuous one day. That's a sine qua non for him, a necessary conditions. However, this initial education could only raise decent people. True virtue requires a special kind of practical knowledge and education, and that, in fact, is what Aristotle aims to provide with his ethical theory. Aristotle also thought that a human mind is divided into three parts: the rational, the sensitive, and vegetative. It would be impossible to discuss all of these nonsense that differentiate his psychological theory from Plato's here. For our purposes, I will only highlight that Aristotle thought that human virtue was the same for all human beings, well, at least for all the aristocratic Greeks that formed his main body of students. That means, in other words, the Aristotle considered virtue to be more accessible than Plato thought it was. According to Aristotelian ethics, human virtue could be divided into two general categories: intellectual virtues and moral virtues, for virtue of character. And in Aristotle's opinion, wisdom is not one virtue but two distinct intellectual virtues. That is, for Aristotle, there are two kinds of wisdom. I will explain them later. Let's first get a better grasp of what moral virtues are. The moral virtues. The moral virtues are related to the irrational aspects of human soul, like sentiments and desires. It's here that we find virtue like courage and generosity. Aristotle thought that when guided by the rational part of the soul, that is, when our irrational dispositions are regulated by reasons orientated by the doctrine of the mean, these dispositions become virtuous. Of if our irrational disposition are well regulated by reasons, we feel the desire in a way what is most adequate to our nature as human beings. Training for disposition is not easy. It requires a lot of effort and time. But as Aristotle himself says, even if we acquire moral virtues, their possessions is not sufficient to live a virtuous life. We need to correctly apply them in the different circumstances that life presents to us. That is, we need to be sensitive to the specific ethical dimensions of our circumstances. We need to know what we should prioritize as the moment of action. We have to know what we should to do, achieve, and that end, and how in details if possible. We can do it. Another, that's an intellectual capacity, one that Aristotle calls phronesis, practical wisdom or prudence. So far, we discussed about the famous philosophers in Greek history. We have done. Please subscribe our YouTube channel.